Over to Ron.
Look, I'm on East. I took the Council of Canadians, and just by way of speak, I think we have an excellent sequel to this event on the 18th, next Wednesday, with Maud Barlow and Dr. Gus Van Harten. So I hope you get a chance to come out to see it next week. My question is, it seems from listening to you, and thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations, that it's almost like we're asking the government to change itself and to give itself less power. And I have never seen that happen anywhere else that I can imagine. So I'm wondering whether this needs to be much more of a bottom-up approach, and I would like to hear both of your comments on what's taking place in British Columbia now.
Let me just say first, Ron, thanks. And by the way, if any of you are going to hear Maud Barlow and Gus Van Harten next week, this is just an example of the kind of really dangerous thing that can happen. It's not, I just saw the poster and I see it's about water, but if any of you feel moved, please ask Gus Van Harten to describe what happened in cabinet in secret when Stephen Harper got the Canada-China Investment Treaty ratified without any vote in Parliament, binding Canada for 31 years. I won't go into it here, but it'd be a good question to ask Professor Van Harten. Let me just say, we've seen, I want to give credit to Justin Trudeau for a few things he's done. He has actually tried for the first time in a number of decades to somewhat restore cabinet government. Under Stephen Harper, I used to think that the best description of cabinet ministers in the Harper administration, not counting Michael, who so elegantly withdrew from Harper's cabinet. But I remember Don Martin, when he was writing in the Calgary Herald, described Stephen Harper's cabinet members as performing the role usually performed by potted palms. You know, they were in a semicircle behind him. They had no actual control over their department. I think it was a salutary thing worth mentioning that Justin Trudeau has largely restored cabinet ministers and cabinet government so that decisions are made. I'm often tearing my hair out. I'm at my wit's end at bad decisions that are being made. By my own perception is they're bad decisions that are being made at the level of different cabinet ministers around the cabinet table, not PMO barking down the instructions down the line. I would also say I think it was a very important step to have publicly disseminated mandate letters. So this is a first, that prime ministers always sent out mandate letters to cabinet ministers, but they were never made public before. Now in the proposed legislation, which I have to say is very poor indeed on freedom of information in Canada, the new proposal from the Liberals, but it does include something that would be good, which is that all future prime ministers will publish the mandate letters. What happened in British Columbia, it's interesting, is that John Horgan, the new Premier of British Columbia, without anybody even mentioning it, made the mandate letters public because it's now a thing. Once someone begins to create more democracy and more daylight, it does tend to catch on. But the reality of it is that what we're seeing in British Columbia right now is probably our best hope for demonstrating something else about first past the post, which is a bit more ethereal. It's hard to put your hands on the fact that first past the post creates a cutthroat culture. Proportional representation, systems where parties have to work together across party lines in order to survive, according to the phenomenal research by, and I'm sure many of you in this room know the work of Arndt Liebhardt and the book Patterns of Democracy, but I commend it to you. He studied 36 modern democracies and found that empirically those that forced parliaments to work by working across party lines because no one had majority power actually created more stable government, had obviously more women elected, many good things, more stricter environmental regulation. But the culture changes because you realize I really do need to be able to work with these people. So we'd gone through an entire election campaign in BC with the usual nastiness. I have to say it's a first past the post election. You had Liberals saying nasty things about NDPers and NDPers saying nasty things about Liberals and everybody saying nasty things about Greens. We were once again that party that nobody should vote for because it was obviously a wasted vote, right? Anyway, when the dust settled, there we were with 3 Green MLAs and 41 NDPers and 43 Liberals, and you needed 44 to make a majority legislature. What do you do? This is where I think it was a phenomenal lesson for Canadians from coast to coast to see how do we in this country, excuse me, I'm just attracting this fly like, oh, get out. How do we in this country accommodate difference, listen to each other, and actually come up with a government that meets the expectations of the electorate? And it was a deliberative process. I'm very, very proud of my colleagues in British Columbia of all parties, because the process in British Columbia was ever so much more dignified and deliberative than the gong show of Theresa May trying to make friends with Ian Paisley's Northern Ireland party. I mean, my goodness. But they went through it quietly, deliberatively, and only when they had a solution did they announce, we have a confidence and supply agreement, this is how it's going to work. I think the government in BC will hold for a full 4-year term, and I'm hopeful to the question of change bottom up. Yes, our parliament can change our voting system, but Canadians have to demand it, and they have to let Justin Trudeau know as they watch what happens in BC. We like the way that democracy is working, where people from different parties are now more respectful towards each other and working together more.
So Ron, when you asked the question in surprise, why would you want to give power up? You're reminded of the quote that Winston Churchill is attributed to Winston Churchill, where he once said that democracy is a terrible form of government, but it's better than all the rest. And I think that quote that's attributed to him has a truism in it that's, I believe, quite strongly, which is that the single most important invention in our society is our democratic set of checks and balances on power. It's more important, in my view, than anything else we have come up with over centuries. It's more important than the Green Revolution of the last 100 years that's taken us from being largely agrarian societies that experienced famine not infrequently to now a world full of plenty. It's taken us from more important than medical advances, more important than the technological revolution of the last 2-3 decades. More important than any other advance in our society is the advance of the creation, the invention of this idea that the popular will of the people needs to be expressed in those who govern, and that those who govern should be subject to a set of checks and balances on power, so that power isn't concentrated in any one person or any one office. You know, we went from the absolute right of kings and queens to a system of modern democracies where no one person is supposed to have that power. Now, in the short run, as Churchill's quote demonstrates, democracy can be infuriatingly complex and difficult to achieve things. It's not an efficient decision-making system. If you wanted to design an efficient decision-making system, a democracy would be the last place you would start. It's slow, it's cumbersome, it requires compromise, it sometimes has fits and stops and starts, and sometimes doesn't accomplish what you need to get done. You know, action on climate change being a good example of that. But if you take a step back and you look at the broader history at play here, it's clear that these inefficient decision-making systems, these systems that express the popular will of the people that also have checks and balances on power, have produced some of the greatest prosperity, stability, justice, peace that we have experienced in millennia. You know, yes, there's wars around the world, and yes, there are famines still going on, and yes, much of the world's population is still living in poverty. But there have been tremendous advances, and in the historical context, the number of wars is way down, the number of people being pulled out of poverty is ever increasing, and we've never lived in such an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity. And I think that's largely attributed to these democracies that have established these democratic checks and balances on power. And I believe strongly that if we're going to maintain the prosperity, which we have largely inherited, if we're going to promulgate it for the next generation, if we're going to compete against the rise of the rest of the world, against the BRICS and the other emerging economies, if we're going to ensure that our children and grandchildren have the same quality of life that we have inherited, it starts with reforming and restoring and enhancing the democratic sets of checks and balances on power that we have here in Canada, what we call Parliament, and the way in which we elect those parliaments. I believe that so fundamentally is important to the next 100 years in this country, and the reason why I think we need to restore that balance of power to ensure that it's more distributed. And if we do that, I'm confident that this century truly will belong to Canada.
Hang on, Bill, because Richard is the next one, and you'll be next. And go.
Questions? Any women? Sorry. I love all the guys, but we're in for a run of 4 or 5 women for gender balance at this point. Sorry.
Okay, so given that the mics are in their hands, can I identify 1, 2, 3 is the next, 1, 2, 3, 4 is the next women after these 2 gentlemen? So the women will get the next run. So I'm seeing like 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you, Elizabeth. Richard.
Anstad, and I represent the Guelph-Wellington Coalition for Social Justice. I'm a member of that group. My question is that both of you have concentrated on your talks on reducing the concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. My question is that it seems to me on the international and national world stage, there is a growing concentration of power amongst international corporations. How do you see your changing the politics, changing the reducing of power amongst international corporations that seem to have the real power?
So can we take that mic up to the lady? Okay, it's going to a woman. Okay, good.
Is this, yeah, I completely agree. Now, what has allowed corporate rule to take hold so effectively? There's been, and I will just do a quick little bit of diagnosis. I don't know if this is how you would see it, but the way I see it is that whereas free trade in goods is a good thing, people are for it, but we began to see through NAFTA was the first, that created in Chapter 11 of NAFTA superior rights to foreign corporations than to either domestic corporations or its citizens. So every trade deal inevitably and invariably, just as any international treaty inevitably and invariably has some degree of reduction of sovereignty. A country gives up some of its own decision-making because it's agreed to do something collectively. That's not a bad thing. But without any examination, we started having trade deals reduce domestic national sovereignty in favor of corporate rule. And transnational corporations, now with the ability to sue Canada if they don't like decisions that we reach, took on no additional responsibilities, no additional levels of taxation, nothing except the fact that they got away with it once in Chapter 11 of NAFTA. Then again, investor-state dispute resolutions are now all over the place, hundreds of them. Getting that back starts with persuading citizens in any country that they actually have a government that works for them, as opposed to an alien entity that doesn't have their interests at heart, but is looking after the interests of the 1% or global corporate rule. A healthy democracy can arrest and reverse the trends that have allowed the creation of global corporate rule. The irony is that someone like Trump, who managed to excel getting people whose interests were entirely not aligned with his own, given that he's a billionaire, they believed him about some things because he spoke to a really deep set of concerns that globalization was not working for people. Trickle down isn't working for people. It works for the 1%, but it doesn't work for most people. And as somebody who might be railing about individual trade deals, you never hear Donald Trump say anything against global corporate rule. He's just fine with it. So I think that these things do go hand in hand. Whatever the issue is, wherever you feel that we're at risk from, and there are many things, but you've put your finger on a key one in terms of social justice and national sovereignty, a healthy democracy can raise up the voices of the people like Maud Barlow and Gus Van Harten and say, no, this has gone too far. We need to reverse these and make sure that if we're giving global corporations additional rights, they've taken on some kind of additional responsibilities, that there's some kind of benefit to us in giving them these privileges. That's something that a healthy democracy can do. And then again, Michael's proposals and electoral reform get us to that healthy democracy.
Yeah, just quickly building on what Elizabeth said, I think there are two other things that we should do, and one of them's in progress, which is to ban all corporate and union donations from the political process in Canada. I think that was done at the federal level about a decade ago, and I think it's had a positive impact on federal politics. All union and corporate donations are banned, even in-kind donations, and I think that has significantly cleaned up Ottawa. I think we need to apply the same thing to provincial and municipal politics in Ontario, and I think steps are being taken to do that, and it couldn't have happened soon enough. I think the other thing that we need to do is, as elected officials, we have to be very careful that we don't allow large corporations to become rentiers in our system, that we don't allow for a tight, cozy relationship between large corporate interests and the federal government. And, I can think of a number of deals struck in recent years that favor large corporate interests that don't favor ordinary citizens or much smaller businesses that don't have that kind of lobbying power. I'll give you one example. It's in front of Parliament right now. There's a bill to amend the Canadian transportation policy. It amends a number of acts of Parliament, but it's going to give Air Canada a very cozy deal. That's to the benefit of Air Canada as a large corporation. And look, I support Air Canada. It's one of our flagship carriers. It's a good airline. It employs tens of thousands of people throughout Canada, and it's something that we should all be very proud of. But at the same time, I believe in open competition, that corporations shouldn't use government policy to shield themselves from competition in order to make excess profits on the back of Canadian consumers. Well, there's a bill in front of Parliament that would shield Air Canada from competition, would allow them to hike airfares on transborder routes, in order to increase their profits to the detriment of you, the flying public. It allows Air Canada to enter into joint ventures without going through a full Competition Act review, and it allows them to enter these joint ventures without any restrictions. So that's one example of the types of policies that we should be opposing in order to make sure that power is properly apportioned between consumers as citizens and large corporations in this country. And it's a constant fight, because the tendency with large corporations who have the budgets to lobby and to make the news is to shield these large corporations from competition rather than acting in the interests of the broader public.